Hi, this is Joe Lawrence with the Cornell PRODAIRY program. Today's topic will be managing for quality silage, specifically in bunk silos and piles. Um, I like to start out with this slide from Dr. Lehman Kung with the University of Delaware, where it really just highlights the point that we need both good practices in the field to produce a quality forage, and then excellent silage management to uh, to end up with a quality silage reaching the cow. And certainly, silage management is important in any storage structure that you use, but there are some unique opportunities and challenges related to horizontal silos or bunks or piles, however you want to refer to them as. So that's what we're going to focus in on today. And I will just start with, we have some materials on our website related to harvest management considerations for both hay crop silage and corn silage. And you could refer to our website for more materials on this, because certainly the harvest management process is very important. And we need to get that quality silage out of the field, or quality forage out of the field in order to have a chance of making a good quality silage, as the last slide indicated. So when it comes to silage storage, we're really talking about the preservation of dry matter. At the end of the day, it's the pounds of dry matter that we have available to feed the herd of animals and the quality of that silage as well. So we want to minimize respiration losses through the fermentation process by making sure we have a high density using scientifically proven inoculants, and good face management at feed out are some key characteristics of minimizing those losses. We also want to think about the consistency of the feed we are able to have in the ration and how much carryover of feed we have, and maximize the feed we can store in a given footprint. And we'll go into all of these in more detail. So throughout this, we'll intertwine some safety, because safety is a very important topic related to these storage structures. And it really starts with properly sizing and constructing your storage area in order to set yourself up for a safe operation. And sometimes there tends to be a bit of a conflict between safety measures and efficiency and that sort of thing, but that's not the case with horizontal silos. In this case, actually, good safety and high quality silage are strongly linked, because a lot of the practices that are promote safety also are our best management practices for a high quality silage. So we'll start here by thinking about how we set up our storage and how we prepare for the season. So as you prepare for a given harvest season, it's good to think about what your options are. One thing when we're feeding out silage is it's having a high quality silage or even a medium quality silage for a certain group of animals is only useful to us if we have it accessible at the right time. So we need to think about where we're storing this feed, and especially with something like hay crop silage, thinking about what happens if it gets rained on? What happens if we have the opportunity to make some really high quality feed? And where are we going to store that? Because if we're storing that all in the same storage structure and it's all mixed together, that limits our opportunities to really take advantage of the quality of that feed at feed out for different groups of animals on the farm. So if we can have, make some investments in our storage area to have some flexibility in where we store different qualities of feed, then that feed is always accessible to us. And we can target the right group of animals with the right quality of feed at any given time in the year if we have that flexibility. And I would argue this is a place where we could see some really high returns on investment in terms of upgrading our feed storage areas to really give ourselves more flexibility um, in how we are able to manage it at feed out. So moving on from there, just thinking about the sizing of our bunk, again, related to both safety and silage quality and preservation, having an undersized bunk area leads to a lot of issues. If we're packing our silage above the walls at an unsafe height, we see substantially more shrink losses when we're above the walls like that. So just some basics on thinking about what our inventory needs are, so we can start by calculating that from the animals we have and how much we're feeding them, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. And then think about how much carryover we want from one year to the next, both from the standpoint of if we have a poor crop year with poor yields, we want some extra inventory. We also want, at least a minimum of like 45 days to allow our haylage to properly ferment. And with corn silage, we'd rather let it ferment for 3 to 4 months to really start to optimize the starch digestibility. So when we start calculating how many total tons of feed we need, and then what our capacity is in a given bunk, we need two numbers: the density, which is the pounds of material per cubic foot, and then figure out the number of cubic feet or the area. And we can have some odd shaped bunks and piles, and technology can help us to some extent with that these days. There's more and more companies offering drone flights where they can fly a drone over your pile and get a perfect outline of how many cubic feet of storage are there. You still need an accurate density to calculate the capacity, because if you're using an inaccurate density measurement, having a really accurate area is not that helpful. But if we don't have access to a drone to fly over a pile, we can break it down into some simple math. And even with some odd shaped bunks, we can generally break it down into rectangles and some right triangles. So the part above the walls that crowns on top, we could, even if it's rounded a little bit for estimate's sake, we can break it into some right triangles. And as well as the ramp going up into the bunk can be considered a right triangle. So if we have those measurements, we can calculate our area, and then we'll get into the density part here. The other thing that we really want to think about with sizing, especially a bunk with walls or even a drive over pile, is the area for feed out and how much we're feeding out per day. Ideally, we would like to take 10 to 12 inches off of that face every day to keep it fresh. Some references are a minimum of 6 inches, especially in the colder months, but that may not be adequate during the summer. So really we have to, look at the width of the pile and the height of the pile and calculate, how many pounds or tons per day we're feeding out, and determine the number of inches that we're taking off per day. So that's another factor that should be considered when we're trying to right size our pile areas. And if you already have a bunk with fixed wall width, you can't really change the width in that case, but you can adjust the height of how much you put in there. So if you're struggling to get that 10 to 12 inches of feed out per day, you may consider trying, reducing the height of how much material you put in that bunk. And that may be viewed as being a waste of space by not maximizing the space. But again, we see significantly more shrink losses when you go substantially higher than the walls. Plus, if you're going to have additional shrink losses, you're going to have additional shrink losses by not maintaining that target feed out rate. So even though you think it might be a less efficient use of space to reduce the height of the pile, you're more than likely to make up for any of those losses, or sorry, make up for that having a smaller pile by reducing your shrink losses that would come from having an oversized pile and a face that was too big. So getting into some of the biggest safety hazards, and I bring these up because again, it all goes into how well we manage our bunks for both quality and safety. So some of the biggest hazards are fatigue. Certainly, harvest is always a busy time of year, so taking care of yourself or your employees, just making sure that everyone's paying attention and that we don't get complacent with these somewhat kind of routine tasks like packing or transporting silage in a wagon or a truck. Rollovers, especially, trucks trying to drive on piles to dump and stuff like that, we strongly discourage that. Just watching around equipment. At feed out, we could have moving parts like defacers. We need to be careful with equipment like that. We have issues with tall faces and potentially working near the face of the bunk. And avalanches are unfortunately fairly common and have led to some losses of life because of, you think about how many tons of feed are in these areas, and an avalanche can be several tons of feed coming down on someone. This picture shows one where it essentially caved in the window of a payloader. And then silo gases, which some people tend to think of as more of an issue with like upright silos or more confined spaces, but that we do know of instances where silo gases have formed even within bunks. And this information comes from the Keith Bolson Silage Safety Foundation, and I'll have a link to their website later, but there's a lot of really valuable information there related to the silage safety around bunks and piles. So one thing we can do is, do some pre-harvest inspections of our current storage spaces, especially with tall concrete walls. These are portable walls, but even with poured concrete walls, over time, we can start to see deterioration of that concrete and safety issues. And we'd really rather, catch those before harvest than have an accident during harvest due to an unsafe wall. When we start thinking about filling, again, having the right size bunks so we're not pushed into these situations where we're going way above the walls and creating very unsafe circumstances and a lot of shrink loss. Again, there's very little packing along these steep sides, and shrink losses can be significantly higher, even if the density is good and the losses are relatively low in the center of the pile. These parts above the wall can be pretty high loss areas. Some recommendations for the slope of the ramp, a 3-to-1. So in other words, for every 3 feet of length, you go up 1 foot. So if you had a maximum height on your bunk of 10 feet, then you would multiply that by 3 and your ramp should be about 30 feet long. When we're packing on side slopes on top of a bunk, we should, because the tractors are driving along that slope, there's more risk of them tipping over or silage sliding out. So we'd really rather have more of like a 6-to-1 slope there on those sides of drive over piles or the tops of bunks. We often see scenarios where maybe we finish feeding out one feed and we put another feed within that area. This can be dangerous for a couple reasons. The main one is that these two types of feed often they're not really meshed together. There's usually kind of a defining line between them. And that can be a really dangerous place for avalanches to happen, because that one layer of feed can slide off the other layer quite easily, especially if there's some spoilage in between those different layers of feed. This pile here, where we were taking samples, was only about shoulder height, so it wasn't like it was super tall. But again, as you fed out one of these areas, then you're adding several more feet of height, and this, you can see this really bad spoiled feed here is going to create kind of a slimy layer where one layer is going to slide right off of the other. Again, anything above the walls requires extra care. This was a situation where the tractor got off the edge. Fortunately, no one was hurt. But again, if you look at this, just by the pictures, it's not like we're 20 feet above the walls or some crazy number like that. This is an instance where this pile was just a few feet above the walls. It wasn't even necessarily that steep or anything, but it's a risk anytime we get above the walls, and we need to really think about what we're doing there. Then we get to feed out again, these risk of avalanches, especially with tall faces. It's just not worth going near the face of a bunk. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Trying to sample for density, if you're trying to collect a sample to send to the laboratory for a forage analysis, it doesn't matter. It's not worth going near those bunk faces. We've learned this over the years, and unfortunately people have lost their lives because of it, and we just need to get away from that practice. Just a few examples, here's a kind of a jagged bunk, some spoilage on top. There's certainly some avalanche risk there, and we see it's taller than this payloader. Here's one where we see silage that just broke away from the rest of it and is just leaning over there. There's a substantial amount of weight there in that area, that if that tipped over onto someone or even onto a piece of equipment, could cause a lot of damage. So when it comes to management and safety issues, one area we often talk about is pulling back plastic and the spoilage on the top. So one of the best ways to eliminate any safety issues of dealing with spoilage is to eliminate the spoilage itself, using oxygen barrier plastics, making sure we're doing a good job covering with the plastic and weighting it down with tires or sandbags, all of that stuff. The more spoilage we can eliminate, the less safety issues we potentially have when dealing with it. And if we are on top of a bunk like this, what we're starting to see to be more common practice to wear harnesses that are tethered to some sort of weight at the back of the bunk, or have some sort of moving railing that might be attached to the front of the payloader, that you can essentially, it's a portable railing you can put up against the face to help stabilize it. And another thing in this picture again is you can see the color differences. There's probably a couple different layers of feed here, and so not only do we just have a fall risk for this guy up here, but there's also that risk of this top layer. This would be a prime candidate for this top layer just sliding right off the middle layer, and all that, creating an avalanche. So some companies have worked to put out some safety materials. This certainly isn't a promotion of one versus another, but just a few examples of some materials that are really well put together and also available online that you can access. So moving on, again, where safety, cost, and quality are all strongly linked together. The better job we do constructing the pile, packing the pile is all minimizing losses is all going to improve safety as well. And one of the biggest areas for this is density. So if we have we know that dry matter losses are higher when we have a poor density. And when we think about those losses, often referred to as shrink, it's both a loss of quantity and quality. So when we think of the loss of quantity, that costs us a fair amount of money, and it increases the number of acres we need to grow that feed. So we're growing extra acres of feed. We have those extra costs of planting, maintaining, and harvesting those acres, and we never get to actually utilize that feed for cows. And then we have a loss of quality through where we have potential decreases in nutritional value, palatability, and can even have some animal health issues with poor fermentation. So our target densities really, if a lot of things you read in the industry are a minimum of about 45 pounds as fed per cubic foot, but I would argue that 50 plus pounds is both more desirable and achievable. We've worked with enough farms that are achieving this range here that I think there's really no excuse for just trying to shoot for that minimum of 45. We know we can be successful getting to these higher numbers when we put some effort into it. So when we think about the acreage needs, there's certainly a number of different calculators out there. This is a basic one that's available on our website, and it allows you to put in the number of animals in a given age group and how much they're eating each day of each forage, what your yields are per acre, and but then we don't want to stop there because that's simply taking into account how many acres we would need to grow that forage for that number of animals if we weren't accounting for any shrink losses or any other any carryover, anything like that. So we know that there's usually about a minimum of a 10% shrink just through the fermentation process. That's our cost of fermenting the feed, can be close to 10%. And then we may have some other few percentage points of other losses on top of that. So if we started with something like a 15% shrink loss, that's kind of a reasonable starting point. Unless you have documented that you're doing a really superb job on your farm and reducing losses, then maybe you could get that number down to 10 or 12 or something like that. And then we have to think about, how much feed do we want to carry over, and do we have enough acres to have that inventory? So this spreadsheet allows you to factor in those different things. So when it comes to thinking about the cost of shrink, if we take that example of corn silage for 100 lactating cows at 18 tons per acre and feeding 25 pounds of dry matter per cow per day, with no adjustments at all, it would be 72 acres. But if we adjust for 10% shrink, that now we're up to 80 acres we need to cover those animals for just 365 days. But what if we have higher shrink numbers, and unfortunately we do still see higher shrink on a number of farms. Certainly the industry has made progress over the years, but we still see a lot of opportunity areas on a number of farms. So if we start there, and then if we think about 25% total shrink, so that's an extra 15% shrink on top of your fermentation losses. Now we're going from 80 to 91 acres that we need to cover to feed that 100 cows. So essentially that 15% extra shrink means for every 100 cows you're feeding, you need an additional 11 acres of corn. And when we think about the cost of fertilizer, the cost of corn seed, the cost of fuel, the cost of harvesting per acre, that's significant cost that you're incurring for feed that is never going to reach the cow. Another factor is when we look at storage space efficiency is if we have a low density, it's an inefficient use of storage space. So we have to think about the cost of that. Certainly, if we're not using our storage space efficiently, then we have to build additional storage space, which is going to be added cost. We also have to think about the footprint in terms of especially stuff like leachate collection systems. If we have more area under concrete because we have to have more bunks due to not packing them well, then we need to, we're going to be collecting more rainwater. And then certainly there's a safety issue that we already talked about. So this is just a basic example of a couple different bunk sizes. And how many cubic feet would be in those, and then looking at a dry matter density of 14, which kind of corresponds to that 45 pounds as fed as a minimum, versus just getting it up to 16, which might be 48 pounds as fed. So that's not even getting it up to that 50 number that I mentioned really being a good target that I think we should be going after. But when we look at the difference this makes in the tons of feed that can be stored in that area, it's pretty significant. And this, gets back to the idea around how high do we have to go above the walls? Well, if we have a low density and we're going way above the walls, simply improving our density could mean we could store the same tonnage of feed in that footprint and not have to go above the walls, because we could improve our density and therefore get the same amount of feed in there and be several feet shorter in terms of the maximum height of the pile. So how do we get to that density, those higher densities? Well, there's been this rule of thumb of 800, and what this is a minimum of 800 pounds of packing weight per ton of forage being delivered per hour. So the example would be something like if you had 45 tons per hour being delivered to the bunk, you'd multiply that by 800 pounds, and that means you would need 36,000 pounds of packing weight. But we also have to factor in that our pushing tractor is only packing part of the time. So we can't, and sometimes that's our heaviest tractor, but we don't want to account for 100% of its time packing the bunk due to it's not on the bunk all the time. So we need to factor that in and reduce its contribution. And this chart here, the idea here is you can find your delivery rate, 130 tons per hour, follow that over until you get into the green, and then follow that up to get an idea of how many tons of tractor weight you need for that delivery rate. So it's just, you can use your calculator and use the 800-pound rule, or use this quick chart. So if we need to get a high density, what are some of the factors that are going to limit that our ability to get that high density when we're going into harvest season? So first of all, if there could be a mismatch between the delivery rate and the packing weight we have available, as we saw in the last slide. So in these cases, we either need to strategize on how to increase our packing weight or slow down our delivery rate. Dry forages, especially if they're cut long, tend to be harder to pack. We can still achieve a good density. We just have to work harder at it. If our layers are too thick, and we'll get into that in a minute, if we have a poor base, the most effective way to pack is to have a firm base that you're packing against, and then continuing to pack layer on layer on top of that firm base. If we're starting out with a spongy base layer, we're going to be battling that all day long and packing against that spongy base instead of a hard base. And then, again, if we have too little space, if we're going to unsafe heights, or the slope of our ramps are too steep, or if we just have unsafe infrastructure, all of those things are going to make it harder to achieve a good density. So what does effective packing look like? What are some of our options? Tires, we kind of want to do the opposite of what we do in the field in terms of reducing compaction on our soils. We want to maximize compaction so we can increase tire pressure. Again, we'll cover layer thickness. We can add weight. We can add concrete blocks, ballast to the tires, the fuel tank. That might seem like a funny one, but some of these tractors can have several hundred gallons of fuel in a full tank, and that could equate to an extra ton of weight. Or, do we need to rent an extra tractor to get to just match our delivery rate? Making sure our slope of the ramps are proper, so that we're not trying to push feed up a really steep ramp and kind of chewing up the forage and spinning out our tires. And reduce fill rate. A lot of people don't like to hear this when they're busy in harvest and there's uncertainties with the weather, but it can really pay dividends. And there's ways to reduce fill rate without, actually slowing down the number of wagons or trucks you have delivering. One example could be if you fill multiple bunks at one time, essentially to each bunk, you've cut your delivery rate in half. If you're filling 2 bunks at once, you just still need to make sure you have enough packing weight on each of them. So this packing weight and layer thickness is an important one. Again, we want to be packing against a firm base all the time, so we're not packing against a spongy material. And that starts right from the beginning. The first layer of forage we put in, we often see farms that, that first couple loads that come in, they may just kind of loosely spread it out in the bunk, and then you end up with, 12 inches or something of just loosely packed stuff at the bottom of the bunk. So now for the rest of the time, instead of packing against a concrete pad, you're packing against a spongy layer of stuff that was spread out in there but never packed very well. And we know this from, we see this in road construction where they pack in really thin layers of material and make sure it's packed to an adequate density before they add another layer on top of it to build a solid foundation. And because we know if we have too thick of layers, we can never improve the density of the layer that's underneath the newest layer we put on. So we have to have that layer underneath packed adequately before we put a new layer on top of it. And the University of Wisconsin has a really nice spreadsheet where if you put in accurate information in terms of the size of the bunk, how much packing weight you have, what your delivery rate is, it does a nice job of predicting the density of that silage. And one of the adjustments you can make to that spreadsheet is layer thickness. And so I created a scenario where I left everything else the same. Tractor weight was the same, delivery rate was the same, dry matter was the same, bunk size was the same. And then I just adjusted the layer thickness. I started out with a 6-inch layer. And so in this case, it took 4 tractors or about 85 tons. Again, our push tractor is only packing part of the time, but took 4 tractors to get our density up to 16 pounds of dry matter with that 6-inch layer. If we leave everything else the same in the spreadsheet and reduce that layer thickness to 4 inches, now we've achieved that a very similar density with just 2 tractors on the pile. So this, this isn't a cure-all. You still have to have other practices in place, but it just highlights how important it can be to really have our person that's operating that pushing tractor really focus on getting their layer thicknesses as thin as possible. We know that's especially hard with haylage that tends to like to ball up as we're pushing it, but an experienced operator that is motivated and paying attention to this can really work at doing a nice job of getting thin layers spread out there, and it will substantially help you in improving densities. So moving on in the process, other ways to kind of enhance our storage and silage quality. Two would be inoculants and making sure you're doing a good job covering it. And the commonalities between these two um, practices is they can enhance management, and but they're not a band-aid for other issues. They're not gonna fix other problems um, in the ensiling process. And at this point in time, to me, they should be considered common practice. Years ago, there were always questions about the value of some of this stuff. We have enough data now that we know that, we should just be considering this common practice on every bunk that gets built. Some of the things we should think about are making sure we're using reputable companies, looking for research proven um, products, and making sure we're comparing apples to apples. If we're price shopping, we want to make sure that if one product seems cheaper than the other, that it has the same, for example, the same concentration of bacteria in an inoculant, or the same oxygen permeability in a plastic. We want to, make sure we're comparing apples to apples, and that the cheaper product isn't an inferior product. When it comes to bacterial inoculants, we often talk about them in terms of front end inoculants that aid with fermentation. They enhance that level of good bacteria to produce acid and drop the pH. This can help speed the fermentation process and reduce dry matter losses. And Dr. Bolson, when he was still with us, had shared this, where over 200 studies they had done with over 1,000 silages, and they had positive results of using inoculant greater than 90% of the trials they had done. And then with back end inoculants, these are the ones that help with stability at feed out. So if you have a bunk face that's too big, or you had a compromised fermentation and you suspect that the stability of silage won't be very good, or if you know that it's a bunk that you're going to be feeding out in the hottest part of the summer, it may be worth thinking about using one of these back end products. So how do we get the most out of our inoculants? We really want to make sure that our coverage is good. Low volume applicators are really convenient, but they reduce our margin for error. The only way the inoculants work is if we get good uniform coverage over the silage. So we don't want to be throwing this on top of the wagon of feed or something like that. Ideally it's going on at the chopper where it's getting a nice uniform coverage. And we want to make sure that we're maintaining those systems, that we don't have plugged nozzles or hoses or broken hoses, that everything's working correctly. We also want to make sure that we're storing these inoculants. They're living materials. We want to keep them alive, so we don't want to leave them cooking on the dash of a tractor or truck for in the sun and killing that material. And then when it comes to the use of the back end products, there's always questions about, again, we've covered some of the reasons they should be used. So, but what is their value? Well, there are some trade-offs with them, not just in cost, but also they do actually burn up a little bit of dry matter in the way they work. But a meta-analysis, so this is a summary of 158 studies that was coordinated by the University of Florida, found that these products boosted aerobic stability by 74%. And again, if we have suspect stability issues in our feed, it might be good to use them in targeted, or it is good to use them in targeted ways. Moving on to plastic, certainly, again, we should be using plastic on everything. We should be using a 2-layer oxygen barrier plastic system. To me, that should just be common practice now, making sure we have tire-to-tire coverage, using extra weight like sandbags, especially around the edges, and really making our best effort to keep that pile covered regardless of the weather. And there's just there's no magic solutions out there, no miracles. It's really just doing the work. And yes, putting on 2 layers of plastic is more of a pain than putting on one, but it's worthwhile to do. And then there could, something like lining the walls of the bunk. Even a poured concrete wall can allow some oxygen to penetrate through. We also have issues of water running down between the silage and the wall and having spoilage along those walls. When we start to calculate the cost of that spoilage, especially, on a relatively tall wall that's, maybe a couple 100 feet long, it can be several tons of feed. So if we cover the walls with plastic and, leave 8 to 10 feet hanging over here, and then when we're done filling, we put that plastic over and then put our top layer over, we've eliminated the ability for water to get down into the silage. And now another practice is some farms are starting to put like a field tile along the base of their bunk to help move that water out of there. It may, it works with varying success. I'm not saying it's going to work everywhere, but just, mentioning it as something we're seeing happen more often. I would also challenge you. I often hear, well, if I put plastic against the walls, I'm just going to scuff it with the tires of the tractor when I'm packing and put holes in it, so I'm not going to bother to do it. I think that's a very poor excuse. Frankly, we, if we're talking about a wall that's 10 or 15 foot high and a couple 100 feet long, and we scuff it a couple of times and put a couple of holes in it with the tractor tires, that's minimal. We're still protecting over 99% of the feed from that water penetrating down in or oxygen penetrating in. So a few scuffs in a large bunk are just, it's such a minimal amount of damage compared to what we're protecting that it's not a good excuse for not doing it. So to wrap up, the whole harvest process really comes down to it's a very fast moving process, and with modern day equipment we can ensile many tons of feed in a short period of time. So if we make a decision or skip one of these steps in the heat of the moment, it can mean we're negatively impacting many tons of feed, and it can be a problem for the next 12 to 15 months that you're going to be utilizing that feed. So stuff we think about, the safety and filling, don't skip steps there. It's gonna come back to bite you. Making the decision just to keep chopping even if the forage is too wet is certainly going to be problematic in terms of both ensiling and fermentation, as well as forage quality, especially if it's something like immature corn silage. A tractor breaks, one of your packing tractors breaks down, and you just continue filling at the same rate while that broken tractor is being fixed. Again, you could be ensiling several tons of feed with inadequate packing weight while you wait for that tractor to get fixed. The kernel processor isn't adjusted correctly, or something happens to it and it gets opened up. All of a sudden you've chopped for a day or more with inadequate processing. We mentioned the inoculant applicators. It could have a plug or a broken hose, and all of a sudden we've put several hundred tons of feed through the chopper with no inoculant going on it. So just paying attention to those little things and making sure that we're not skipping a step that's going to have a negative influence on our feed is really what defines a well-managed ensiling process. So that's what we had related to this topic today. Again, I'd encourage you to visit our website or reach out to me directly for more information, or materials related to the field side of things. We focused on the storage today, but certainly as we started out with, we need to be doing a good job with in the field and our harvest practices to get a good quality forage to the silo to optimize these practices. Thank you.